Welcome to Tuesdays with Fortuna, whether it's noon on the East Coast or what is it, midnight if you're just finished dinner in Southeast Asia. We're delighted to have you with us again for another week of insight and expertise for any of you thinking about heading to business school in the year ahead. We've just run a series that looked at some of the broader sort of areas of your personal brand. We had a session on resumes and letters of recommendation and bringing everything together. Well, starting from this Tuesday and moving through the coming weeks, we're going to get school specific. And we've got a series looking at the M7 schools, whatever you choose to decide that the M stands for, whether it's magical, magnificent. And our timing is absolutely spot on. It's always been the case that Harvard Business School leads the dance and announces the first deadlines of the fall. Well, Chad Losey and the team have just announced the dates and deadlines for round 1, round 2, and then for the 2+2 candidates later next year. So September the 8th, take a big red pen and circle that one in your calendar. That's the round 1 deadline, and then round 2 on January the 4th. Which gives you time for some volunteer work over the New Year's weekend. That's a joke. We'll get to that one later. And over the coming weeks, we'll be going through each of the M7 schools. And of course, my great fortune with the team at Fortuna, I'm drawing on so much insider expertise from time spent in the admissions offices and the schools of the M7 and beyond, also INSEAD, LBS and other great US schools. We've always sort of welcomed you to reach out with your personal stories. We managed to cover a lot in the next 60 minutes. I'm sure it'll be no different. But of course, your story, your background, and just your hopes and dreams as you think about business school. We'd love to talk through those next steps with you and bring some of the expertise that you'll witness in the next hour. I talk about expertise, well, that's the panel. I'm delighted to be joined by 3 colleagues and great friends. Carla Cohen, who is a former associate director at Harvard Business School. Well, you can see the theme because we also have Malvina Miller-Complainville, who was a former assistant director at Harvard Business School. And to round that off, Daniel Chan, who's a Harvard MBA, an alum. He was also a former member of the Harvard Business School Admissions Financial Aid Advisory Board. So with that level of background and expertise, I think we're going to have a very, very thoughtful and I hope a very helpful session for all of you. How are you all doing?
Doing great. Doing great.
You're good? Yeah, now we've got a date in the diary and we know what the next 3.5, 4 months are going to look like. I know that you've already started with a lot of clients and perhaps there will be many more. Just to our viewers, and I just see we've got several hundred that have joined us. This is really your webinar. This is your masterclass with such a great group of people. So please, as we go through, send in your questions and we'll be looking at quite a range of topics covering Harvard Business School itself, the culture of the school, your professional background, extracurriculars, the interview, academics. We'll go from A to Z. And as I mentioned, that's something that will then replicate every Tuesday for the weeks ahead as we go through the rest of the M7 schools. So let's get started. And the school itself, what is so special, Carla, about HBS?
So HBS, I was thinking about this question, and my immediate first reaction is like, where do I begin? But I think there's, to summarize it as succinctly as possible, there's really 5 C's that I think define HBS. And first and foremost is the first thing that you'll notice if you're there is the campus. It is a place where it's essentially 33 buildings across 40 acres, which is kind of mind-blowing because it's all for HBS. And so it's the only top business school in the United States with a self-contained residential campus. And so that allows for the creation of my next C, which is an incredible community of individuals. So you'll have, students from all over the world who are extraordinary in all of their different fields. And then you also have the faculty, the staff, the administration, and other individuals and alumni, executives that make for an incredibly powerful, as I've said many times before, it's sort of like a place where masters of the universe can coalesce and come together. Then you have the culture, which is, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around anything other than like when you have such extraordinary individuals coming together, it becomes a place where you're almost limited only by your imagination. And so I think the other piece of it too is that part of the foundational aspect of HBS that distinguishes it from other programs is the case method, which is another C. The case method is how you're going to learn. It requires, you to be someone who can articulate your vantage point and point of view in a way that is both convincing and articulate. And so everyone who's on campus and everyone who is part of this community, very intelligent, very driven, very motivated individuals. The case method is essentially there in the 500 cases that you'll do as an MBA student, which Daniel can talk more about as someone who's been through it. It helps you to make better decisions as a leader and general manager, which it is a general management program. The other pieces are, again, the culture is one where they are going to be looking for individuals who are engaged community citizens, who have an appetite as well as an aptitude and a habit of leadership. So it's an extraordinary place. And then finally, the last C is career opportunities. I think HBS is a place that will unlock whatever door you want to go through essentially afterwards. Like you really can pursue whatever you want, with this degree when it comes to being a leader, whether it's in the public sector, private sector. You've got presidents of different countries. You also have business leaders. Certainly many of the Fortune 500 CEOs have an HBS degree, entrepreneurs. So it again, like becomes a place where it can change everything for you. So there is a magic in that I think is quite powerful.
What a place to start. Michael Porter raises his hat to you for your 5 C's. Of course, there are only 4 Ks to measure a diamond, and diamonds, they say, are forever. Harvard Business School certainly has an enduring appeal. Tanya, were you mindful of those 5 Cs, perhaps not as poetically or articulately expressed as Carla just did, but were you mindful of some of those characteristics?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I was really fortunate enough to have experienced all of that firsthand. So yeah, I'm happy to double click a bit into that culture aspect of HBS and what makes it unique. I think Carla kind of started alluding to this already, but with the case method, you also have what they call section. So your first year is known as your RC year, which stands for required curriculum. Your second year is called your EC year, which stands for elective curriculum. So in your first year, you're put into a section of approximately 90 students, which is meant to represent a microcosm of your broader class. So if your class is 60% male, 40% female, your section should sort of reflect that. If it's 65% American and 35% international, your section should reflect that. So it's sort of your way of kind of experiencing and getting different viewpoints across your entire class, but kind of concentrated into one section. And then you have the case method, which Carla mentioned earlier, which requires an individual to not be a passive learner. So if you're someone who's just looking to kind of attend a lecture and kind of to sit and learn, and not have to speak much or engage much directly with the professor or your classmates, then HBS might not be the best place for you. It's definitely for someone who's not unafraid to share their opinion, unafraid to challenge others. And even if you would say this is not like a particular strength of yours, as long as you're kind of open and keen to developing this into a strength, there's many individuals who kind of come there looking to hone this skill. So section's a unique experience where you get to really, share ideas and battle them out. And obviously with so many different people from different backgrounds, you'll have conflicting opinions, and there's not always a right answer. But it requires you to be engaged, because I think in your first year, about 60 to 70% of your final grade is based on class participation, which is like a very unique way of grading compared to many other institutions, especially compared to your undergraduate grading sort of rubrics. A next bit I think would be, HBS is a bit formal, but not in a bad way. I think there's high expectations that the professors hold of the students and that students hold of each other. So students need to show up on time. There's a huge respect for each other's time and preparation. So like if a class starts at 9:10, as soon as the minute hand hits 9:10, the doors close and the professor begins without missing a beat, professors always start on time. So there's just never a student that kind of scrambles, walking in, saying, excuse me, trying to get in, because that'll be incredibly embarrassing. So there's that respect that folks have for each other and kind of bringing their best self to every class. I would also mention that, HBS is unique in their residential experience. So Carla mentioned, I think 35 buildings or so on 40 acres. I didn't know that exact statistic, but 65% roughly of students will live in Harvard University housing or dorms, which is really unique, where at other schools where folks might have to travel from the downtown to campus, or there might not even be on-campus housing for graduate students. Here, the majority of the student body is living on campus or extremely close to it, which means when it comes to hanging out and socializing, it makes it incredibly easy. But the socializing doesn't stop on campus. It also continues off of campus. So the fact that we're 15 minutes away from Logan Airport, which is a bit ridiculous, that you can hop in a cab in 15 minutes, almost be at your gate, means that weekend travel is prolific. So for those who are looking to travel and to explore the world, it's easy through HBS. But for those who prefer to stay around or have families and don't want to travel as much, there are also plenty of people who stay on campus. So given the size of the class, there is something for everyone.
Now, it begs the question, of course, Taniel, were you ever late? Was that incoming flight to Logan Airport delayed and you didn't get in there by 9:10?
I don't think anyone would risk coming in the morning of of class. So either it's almost kind of like, if you are going to show up late, it's probably better to not show up at all, almost. So students have to be judicious in their travel planning.
Right. Malvina, I suppose as we sort of look across the M7, why Stanford? Why Wharton? What is it about Columbia, Kellogg, MIT, Sloan, Chicago, Booth? But Harvard doesn't ask that question. Why Harvard? Maybe it's because, Carla just nailed the answer of the 5 C's. But why do you think they don't ask that question?
I think that that's a good question, actually, Matt. And you're right. Many of the schools, when you're looking at competitor schools, and will ask the candidate to explicitly explain, why this school and what is it about the program that will help you get to where you want to go, et cetera. HBS doesn't ask that explicitly in the application. It doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't address it. I think there are a number of places within the application where you can address it, head on or more subtly. And it can be in the essay where you speak about some of the gaps that you're looking to fill, and where the match is with HBS. It could be during the interview. It could be so I think that even though HBS doesn't necessarily ask why HBS and explain to us in black and white why the school is a good match, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do the research and that you shouldn't really think carefully about the programs that are being offered by HBS and how they will help you fill those gaps that you've identified.
Right. So, of course, the school, we've mentioned the case method. I love your description, Carla, of it being, just a great way to learn to make good decisions, with very imperfect information, I'm sure. And they're very confident that the 932 individuals that they bring together every year bring a level of academic vigor, vivacity. I don't know how many V's I could apply to that one, Malvina, but just as we look at academics, there's an eye-watering GPA average from one year to the next. So what is the school looking for?
So if you look at, actually HBS defines 3 characteristics of what they look for in successful applicants. And Carla went over it. I don't know if you caught it, but she actually went through those 3. And one is analytical aptitude and appetite. It's a little bit of a mouthful. The other one is habit of leadership. And the third one is engaged community citizenship. So basically leadership, your engagement to your community, and your ability to be analytical, your intellectual ability, your hunger to learn. So that's what they're looking for. And the reason why the analytical aptitude and the appetite are so important is, it is a school after all. You're going to be in a program that is quite intensive. You're going to be going through 500 cases by the time you graduate. you need to reassure admissions that you're not going to struggle academically, that you're going to be able to be successful in that setting. So it's not just about showing them that you'll be able to be successful professionally after you graduate, but it's also showing them that academically you can do it. And in order to get us to, to predict whether you'll be successful in that setting or not, they look at a few things. They look at your track record in college or whatever schooling you did before applying, but also your GMAT score or your GRE score. And they use those as predictive factors. So then the question is, what if you have, what if you're on the lower score for these? And HBS is really good about sharing the stats of the incoming classes. So you'll always find on their website the stats of the last incoming classes, and they tend to be similar. So you have a 3.7 average for the GPA, you have a GMAT that ranges from 620 all the way to 790, so pretty wide range with a median of 730. When you're looking at the GRE, the median for the verbal and quant is 163. And the range is 148 to 170 for the verbal and 145 to 170 for the quant. So what that tells me is there's some room there, and there's some flexibility. But if you're on the lower end of these numbers, you really do need to reassure admissions that you're not going to have an issue. So I've worked with a number of clients who had low or who were on their lower end for their GPA. Something happened while they were in college, or they didn't, they bloomed later, they matured later. And typically this is something that you just would want to address. You'd want to address really directly, not necessarily in the essay. You can use the extra information section to explain, what's the context of those grades, and what were the circumstances, and either what how did you resolve it, or what did you learn from it? But you ideally want to show some kind of upward trajectory, so that if your GPA is on the lower end, ideally you would have a solid GMAT score, so you can reassure admissions that intellectually there's no issue, analytically there's no issue. Another thing that I see is, you may sometimes I'll see people struggle with the math portion on the GMAT, and one way to offset that is actually to take a supplemental class. You could take a statistics class. You could do this online and take a statistics class and just work after work and on the weekends, and just get that additional kind of stamp saying, listen, this is not going to be an issue for me. I can handle this work. And then the other thing I wanted to say is the GMAT and the GRE, I think people test differently with these two these two types of tests. So don't necessarily, spend hours and hours and hours on the GMAT. Try testing with the GMAT and testing with the GRE and see which one is more accommodating to you, which one matches more your style, your learning style. Often I've found that people who may struggle with the math on the GMAT do better with the GRE, for example. So that's kind of a little tip for you. The other thing that I would say is if there's any concern, looking at the GPA, looking at the test scores, if there's any concern with regards to your analytical ability, that's something that you can ask your recommenders to talk about. So when you speak with them and you explain to them, what the schools are looking for in the recommendation letters, you can ask them to focus on the work that you did on a project that was very analytical and your comfort in that space, or how quickly you are intellectually to grasp problems. So make use of the different parts of your application to showcase and reassure admissions.
Great. Thank you for the comforting words about some people blooming later. I'm still working on that one. Carla, based on what Malvina was describing, not just a range of GMAT scores from 620 to 790, so clearly the perfect 800 is a big no-no. Don't any of you apply with the perfect GMAT score. But as you look at 3-4 years of undergrad, possibly even a master's degree, as many as a quarter of applicants have a master's degree, versus a 3-hour standardized test. Inevitably, people ask themselves, well, I look at those averages, I look at those scores, sometimes talk themselves out of it. How does the admissions office sort of weigh 3 or 4 years of concentrated study versus 3 or 4 hours of a test?
It's such an interesting question. And I think the answer is probably not very satisfying, but it depends. I think, it is one thing that people have to keep in mind is that it's a complex assessment. It's not, a lot of times people are like, oh, I have a 740, so I'm not worried about my, GMAT. And I've had situations where, like, actually let me know what your quant is. And I've seen situations where someone with the 690 is actually more competitive than someone with the 740. And a lot of that has to do with what Malvina was talking about with respect to the quant. So the concern is always, with this appetite and aptitude, is that they want to make sure that you're not going to struggle with the rigor of the curriculum, because there's not a lot of time to catch up. And so, HBS core, I think, is an opportunity for you to demonstrate if you don't have a great, undergraduate record, or there's some sort of deficiency. But it really depends. I think it's never about one data point. So they want to look at everything kind of all together. So I think many of you probably know out there that if you have a less than ideal undergraduate record, you'll want to explain that, and you'll want to talk about that in your application. There is a specific place where you can do that, because in the absence of an explanation, they're going to assume not great things. So there could be a reason. There could be a very valid reason. There could have been other, things that were happening in your life that may have prevented you from really coming into your own. And some people hit their stride later. What they want to see is this like upward trajectory, that you're on a pathway towards success. So let's say that you have not a great undergraduate record, then I would spend more time on the GMAT, or as Malvina mentioned, the GRE can be a great place for you to demonstrate the intellectual skill set that you have. They're agnostic about one versus the other. So it's not that like the GMAT is better and then GRE is a second-class citizen in this equation. That's not true. And so I have given the same advice that Malvina has to other individuals who said, wow, I don't know that I would have gotten in otherwise. So keep in mind that the averages don't tell you the whole story. And I think but if you're, the verbal may be more important if you're not a native English speaker. So it's not like a one size fits all. If you're coming from a different part of the world, who've never lived in the States or been in an English speaking part of the world, then they're going to spend more attention on the verbal. If you've been working in artificial intelligence and machine learning at Google, and your quant score isn't exactly where it needs to be, I think, and your undergraduate record reflects, I had a 3.9 in, math and economics, maybe you're just not a great test taker in those 3 hours. So there could be a number of factors, and some people just are not great test takers. So to your question, Matt, the 3 hours of assessment, they understand that may not be perfect. And I think especially this last year with COVID and taking it online, there's been a number of factors that I think have impacted that score. So do the best that you can, but understand that that one data point isn't necessarily going to totally define you. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if you're not sure, talk to a consultant and, ask people's opinions on it, so that you're not just making assumptions or weeding yourself out. I think that would be a mistake. I've had people with a 610 admitted to HBS. So, but they have a really compelling story or a really interesting, background, a really strong undergraduate record. So there's things like that I think can come into play. I think oftentimes people over-index on the power of the test, because that's one thing that they feel that they can control. And I think that's also an issue. So the other thing I wanted to mention further to what Malvina was touching upon and what you were asking, Matt, around why does HBS not ask explicitly why HBS? It's not that they, like Malvina was saying, it's not that they don't care about that, but I do think that they're not looking for your affection for the institution in the application. Because as I remember, Dee once told me, she's like, Dee Leopold, who used to be the admissions director, she's like, who doesn't want to be here? We don't need you to spend a lot of your essay talking about, giving us a dissertation on why the case method is an effective way to teach. We understand that it works very well, and this is why we've committed to it, and this is part of why it defines us. So they would rather understand more about what you have to contribute to the community and what you have to offer, and let's focus on what more do you want us to know in the essay, and not spend the time trying to convince HBS that you understand and appreciate what they've done, or that you would go there if you were admitted, because most people do say yes. There's very few people who turn down that offer. So the concern isn't necessarily on yield. The concern is help us understand what you offer. And so, as we think about extracurriculars, which I know we're going to talk about next, there's other ways to sell yourself and also sketch out a broader portrait of who you are and what you have to offer, you know, and the dynamism that you can contribute, not just inside the classroom, but also outside the classroom.
Right, right. Now, you'll remember last year we did that deep dive into the Harvard classroom, and I think for 96% of the students, we found out where they had studied for undergrad, what they had studied, and then of course the professional trajectory. And I read it in two ways. You know, on the one hand, the Ivy League, Oxford, Cambridge, the IITs, there were certain dominant sort of institutions as feeders. So just a quick follow-up on that, Carla. At the same time, there were as many as 220 or 230 different institutions. One of our viewers has asked, you know, does it matter where you went to school and if your school is not a traditional feeder to HBS?
I don't think it matters, actually. And I think, you know, some of the reflection of like some of these patterns that you're seeing do, you know, it may also reflect the fact that a lot of people that don't have an Ivy League undergraduate education might think that they're at a disadvantage. And I think that's not necessarily true. We would be on the lookout for individuals who, I don't know, maybe went to a state school, you know, but were top of their class. Letters of recommendation, talking about your professional skill set, your potential, you know, to borrow from Stanford, sorry to mention Stanford in this, but like there's this sense of like an insane level of greatness, people who are in ordinary schools doing extraordinary things. And so I think you can really stand out there. And I think they don't want to just have the class filled with well-known Ivy League institutions. And I think especially now, I mean, it's when I look at the undergraduate admissions, you know, it's like what, a 2% admit rate at a place like Harvard. Plenty of extraordinarily intelligent, ambitious, committed individuals who are going to change, you know, the communities that they're a part of, you know, may not go to schools that are in the top 20 or 50. There's many different reasons for that. Some really brilliant individuals may have a full ride at a state school and may have financial concerns. They're not going to punish you for that. So they're actually on the lookout for individuals who may come from different corners of the globe, different, you know, parts of the US News and World Report rankings. You know, you could show up anywhere on that system. And so I wouldn't exclude any program. Now, I think it would be very difficult if you went to not a top school and did not have top grades. And impossible if you did not have a strong GMAT score. So it's a combination of all of these elements. And so, you know, not to mention your essay as well as letters of recommendation. And so you want to put your best foot forward in every single aspect of the application to be able to demonstrate that you'll be someone, if admitted, who will thrive and contribute to the community. And that's really what they're after.
Right. Now, we've had so many questions. I think if we just covered the questions for the next 40 minutes, we'd use up all of our time. Thank you to all of the viewers that are writing in with some great questions. And Mamdouh, based on what Naveen, Carla, Taniel have been saying, with your 3.7 out of 4, and you know, you're first in your class with excellent honors, that's a great platform from which to build your application. And the rest of this webinar, of course, is going to look at the other components. But perhaps at the end, we'll have one of those quick fire rounds, and I'll come back. As soon as you mention the GMAT, it's like opening a Pandora's box. But we do want to do one. Taniel, I'm going to come to you in terms of professional experience, and even just the way that we frame this, the implication that there's a right background. As you think back to your section, to those 93 among 930, there is no one background, right?
Yeah, I think what makes, you know, HBS so unique is that it is one of the larger business schools. You know, it's approximately 900 students per year. So as a result, they can afford to, you know, take many people from different backgrounds. And as we mentioned earlier, because the case method demands class participation and differences in opinion, it's pretty boring if everyone was a consultant or if everyone was a, you know, investment banker or came from private equity. So if they wanted to, they could easily fill up their entire class with consultants. But that would lead to a very boring class discussion. So as Matt mentioned, in many ways, there is not a single profile. I think rather they're just looking for people with like a certain passion and vigor for something, because, you know, those who do have a passion and vigor are those who are going to kind of go off and do something really cool and make an impact in their given sector or their community. So it's important to have like a background and story that gets them excited about the trajectory you'll be on. So it's not necessarily just about where you are now at this given state in time, but kind of convincing HBS sort of through your essay that like, I'm going to do great things. and get them excited about your profile. Carla mentioned yield before, which I think, HBS is relatively unique in its yield. And for those who are unfamiliar, yield is the percentage of students who are admitted who ultimately choose to attend. So at HBS, it hovers just above 90% every year, which means they get to basically handpick their class. And they know very well early on from round 1, round 2, whoever they admit, 9 out of 10 times are coming. So they know who's coming. So as a result, I think they get to be very picky and choosy about who they admit. So I think you want to show, ideally, in your background, that you've navigated your career with intention, and that anything you mention about sort of your future professional goals, that there is sort of a connection. If there's a huge disconnect, I think for many it'll raise some eyebrows. So, there are often times I'll speak with prospective students who mention that they're passionate about sustainability, or they're passionate about healthcare, or they're passionate about, underbanked individuals, but then there's nothing on their resume to suggest so. Then the concern from the folks who are reading this is like whether or not the individual is being disingenuous in their application, right? Like, okay, great. Like, you've spent 3 years in consulting. You say you're passionate about sustainability, but nothing about your extracurriculars, nothing about your professional experience suggests that. Am I really convinced? So, to the best of your ability, where you can, and if it makes sense, get a diversity of experiences is always helpful, especially if you're coming from like a more traditional background of banking or consulting. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult, from what I've seen, to go to HBS with like just a pure consulting background or a pure banking background, where like there's so many of those. So how are you going to differentiate yourself? Like, do an externship if your firm allows it, or maybe take that kind of bold step of trying something new and going directly into the space you're interested in and giving your application some credibility. I would say for those who are coming from maybe less represented backgrounds, so maybe hardcore engineering, some of the sort of CP marketing type roles, for those, I feel like it's less of a concern to stay at your company, throughout the tenure prior to you attending business school. But for those individuals and folks more broadly, I think you just really want to show growth, both in your title and your responsibility. And I think they also want to show that you have a diverse skill set. So I think it's not super valuable if you just if you apply to HBS, just kind of proving that you're a numbers junkie and then you can crunch Excel like no other. But they also just want to show that you have a human side to you. To the best of your ability in either your resume, but especially through your recommenders, if they can kind of show a balanced side of you as a professional, that you are both analytical but also caring as a manager, if that's relevant for you, I think will go really far.
Questions coming in about how personal you can be in that essay. We'll be coming to the essay later on. And just to remind all of our viewers that in previous weeks, we've had dedicated sessions looking at sort of your strategic positioning, looking at your resume, a really deep dive into letters of recommendation. So some of the questions that are coming in about who to choose in terms of recommenders, you can catch that on Fortuna's YouTube channel, because we really do discuss that one in great detail. Perhaps one detail that I'd want to pick up on, Carla, and it'll feed into the next section on extracurriculars. You talked earlier about a habit of leadership, and it's this idea that whether in terms of your professional impact and performance, whether in that Bollywood dance group that you join every Thursday evening, a community across all of these, it's the ability for the admissions office to join those dots, how you've had impact professionally, and the habit that also extends perhaps as a member of your academic community and in your extracurriculars.
Yeah, I think, the thing that they're looking for is they want to attract individuals who are going to be participants in all that HBS has to offer. And so, the academic and the GMAT and the GRE help them get a sense of how are you going to perform in the classroom. But there is so much more to the experience at HBS than being in the classroom. That's a great experience, but they want to see, individuals who are going to participate in the classroom and outside the classroom. And so there's no one way to do that. The habit of leadership, and I'm going to throw another C at you, is commitment to that activity. I think is something that, like Daniel touched on it with, sort of like being convincing about, in the same way that you don't want to just like come up with something, or all of a sudden you're doing something maybe 3 months for the first time right before you apply to business school, that's suspicious. So I recommend that but also want to say that too, is that sometimes I think people overdo it and it can also become very suspicious. If you are a consultant who's on the road all the time and working, I don't know, 100-hour weeks, or you're an investment banker or in private equity, and you're at one of the top places, like, I don't know, a Blackstone or CD&R or Carlyle, that kind of place, like, it's like very not believable if you are trying to present yourself as someone who's spending 15 to 20 hours a week doing extracurricular activities, and you're on multiple service volunteer work, sort of, whether it's boards or organizations. So that can become suspicious too. You want to help them understand, like, what are you passionate about in terms of your professional life, as well as outside of, the classroom / outside of work. And so this can come in many different shapes and sizes. And I do think that it's different, and that difference is also important. So you don't want to just like join a board because someone else, or join an organization just because someone else did, unless that's something that is like fulfilling to you, energizing to you. So I've seen people who have, again, I wouldn't recommend, as you had highlighted earlier, I'm going to go walk some puppies on New Year's Eve or whatever is the thing that's going to be convincing. You want to show a sustained commitment over time. So there are opportunities for people to look back at, what did you do during college? And maybe there's an opportunity, or maybe you have been involved in something else that shows that you care about, not just your own professional success, but that giving back is a part of the fabric of your existence and what you do, and that you prioritize that. That said, I've worked with individuals who, I don't know how they manage to get everything done, but they are working in, high demand, high performing roles within top institutions, who do make time for food rescue, or they've started a blog on, something that's really interesting to them, or they have a passion for, one of my clients was really interested in a certain type of music and attended different, sessions with friends and got people together. So one like sort of clue is to look at HBS clubs, because that's what they're trying to get a sense of. And there's so many. There's an arts club, there's a music club, there's there's so many different organizations that are part of the community that I think can give you a little bit of a sense of like, and so they're trying to figure out, if we admit you, excuse me, what are you likely to involve yourself in and be engaged in, beyond just being someone who's extremely bright, extremely ambitious, and participatory in the classroom and in the discussion and in the case method.
So the word leadership has come up almost as many times as the 5, now the 6 C's that Carla has defined for us. Staying on the theme of leadership, Malvina, before we get there, of course, during your time at the school, you worked very closely with MBA students and their sort of post-MBA career goals and objectives. When we took the deep dive looking at the class and their pre-MBA professional experience, very striking how many individuals perhaps had worked at a McKinsey, Bain, BCG, successfully applied straight to business school. When you compared that to financial services, and certainly in tech, a lot more movement in tech. And within financial services, the number of investment banking analysts that after a couple of years and before that third year looks just like the second year, they made a switch. And whether it was into private equity, whether it was to join the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, well, whatever we now call the Gates Foundation, I guess that will remain, the sort of breadth. So just before, and how leadership can then emerge from that, questions are coming in, what if I just worked with one company? What if I worked with several companies? Now you then worked with those incoming students at the school. What are your thoughts in terms of the balance and of course the background and experience that will bring?
So, I mean, I think there's your question touches on a few things actually. One is, what is that student bringing to the classroom in terms of the experiences that they've lived, and the richness of what they can contribute in the classroom discussions. If they've worked in, I actually find it extremely interesting working with a client who has worked in a number of companies, because they can talk about the different cultures that they've experienced. They can talk about the different types of leadership that they've seen. They can talk about how those companies are organized, if they were more entrepreneurial or if they were more traditional, and the benefits and the pros and cons of that. And they can bring all of those reflections to the classroom and share that with their classmates. And if they've touched on a number of industries or a number of functions, again, it brings richness to what they can contribute. So, that's one aspect. And then the other aspect has to do with, how do you take that with regards to the career goals? I think you were saying, how do you work with someone like that with regards to the career goals? And I think that, when you're doing these applications and when you're presenting yourself to recruiters, you have to look like, you've got it all figured out, and you have the story and you have this narrative, and you were always on track. But I think that everyone knows that the reality is, you clarified things as you went along, right? So maybe your first job was in consulting, and then you realized you loved this particular space, and then you went into that space, and that made you realize that you were really lacking leadership skills, and so you decided to go to business school. So sometimes those narratives and those stories build with experience, and it's taking the time to reflect on the lessons you've learned along the way, and the things that you enjoyed and the things you enjoyed less, which will help you put that story together. Part of the benefits of being in an MBA program, as Tanya I'm sure can share, is that you have the time to do that reflection. You have the time to think about everything that you've experienced, and and how that can inform the directions that you want to go into after business school.
So of course, with many
Yeah.
clients that you've worked with, Malvina, this theme of leadership, whether it's in the professional context, whether it's in extracurriculars that Carla has touched on, can you perhaps just give a few examples of how we're bringing those leadership characteristics to the attention of the admissions office? It's not sort of shouting, I'm a leader, I'm a leader. It's through demonstrating. Right?
And this is a topic that comes up almost with every single client. Probably with every client that I work with, how do I define my leadership skills, and how do I show that I have leadership skills? And often the conversation starts with, I have no leadership skills. I have no leadership experience. And then it's a conversation, looking at what the person has done and breaking down what is a leader and what traits do leaders have, and looking at, okay, so if you're interested in going in this specific field, what does someone need in that specific field to be a leader in that space? And then identifying what that is. It could be critical thinking. It could be, an ability to develop talent. It could be strong communication skills, being able to persuade groups of people. It could be, define those things, and then think about, in my life, whether it was when I was in school in an academic setting, or whether it was in my extracurricular life at school, or in my hobbies, in my nonprofit work, or in my professional work, when did I show some of these things? And you can actually create a graph and just write down, and then as you do this exercise, most often not, you find that you do have examples. For example, someone will tell me, I don't have any direct reports, I have no leadership skills. And I will say, okay, let's look at leadership much more broadly. Do you have any experience, for example, coaching new hires, or mentoring a new hire, mentoring an intern? Okay, yes, okay, so then here you go, you have some talent development experience. And so just breaking down those pieces, and more often than not, the client or the candidate will find that they do have some really interesting experience. I think it's also really important to think about when you're sharing those experiences with admissions, whether it's in the interview or in the essays, and also in the application. Oh, there's a little bit of an echo, I hope. Oh, there's a little bit.
It might be me.
You're okay. It's important not just to focus on the result, And I see this a lot where, you know, someone will give me an example, or, you know, in an interview setting, I'll be given an example and the focus will be on the positive result. But what's can be really interesting is hearing what happened from the beginning to the end, what the process was. How did you come up with the idea? Why was it important to you? Who did you have to convince to get on board with this idea? How did you make this happen? What challenges did you face? How did you surmount those challenges? Or maybe you were not able to surmount all of the challenges. So what did you learn from that experience? Often the whole story provides a lot of insight into who that candidate is, and is much more interesting than just hearing about the result. So a little tip.
Daniel, I have this image of sort of 930 self-confident, preened leaders outside of the Baker Library or the Spangler Building. I'm actually filled with apprehension with that one. But I mean, you all get there. And it strikes me there's often a sense of sort of imposter syndrome of, oh, you know, everybody else must have been remarkable. So just perhaps for our viewers, reassure them, you know, that you don't have to have led an organization of 2,500 people, as Malvina was saying. It can be a much, you know, smaller level, mentoring, helping somebody to go beyond what they thought were their limitations, perhaps.
Yeah, no, imposter syndrome is real for many students. I think a lot of folks do think that they're the admissions mistake. Not unoften that I still wonder about that for myself sometimes, but I think when you have a bunch of like overachievers, you know, I think there's a bit of insecurity that everyone has, so not uncommon. I think, yeah, it's important, you know, they're not expecting, you know, 900 students. I think what they're looking for a lot is just what your potential is. It really comes down to, I think, where are you in your kind of given stage when you apply, and why does business school make sense at that given time? So if you are a 30-year-old applicant, which is on the older side for HBS, above the average, yes, there will be a slightly different expectation of what you will have achieved versus someone who is 23, 24, applying with 2 years. The bar is still high in that they expect you to be a future leader, and they hope that you will go on to achieve something really cool and special. But what you will need to have done will vary. So if you're 30 years old and you at that stage might not have had an opportunity to manage anyone yet, you know, that could be a bit more concerning than a 24-year-old who is still like a second-year analyst in banking. I think it just really comes down to your ability to tell a compelling narrative about the direction that you're headed and why the choices you've made thus far make sense, and then what business school will do to sort of close that gap so that you can achieve that next step in your longer-term trajectory.
Great. So, of course, we're bringing all of this self-reflection together for the next step of how does HBS frame it? You know, we've read the resume, we've read the letters of recommendations. What more should we know about you? And there's no word limit, though. Daniel, in a previous webinar, gave his estimate on you know, the self-discipline. You gave a great example, Daniel, of being in the case and having, what, 60 seconds. So they need you to be succinct. Carla, we're going to start with you, I think, on top essay tips. We won't have the time to cover everything, and we've done other sessions talking about the essays, but what really strikes you or stands out for you in terms of how you approach and need to be thinking about this essay?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, given the question that has been asked, and it's been, you know, in my memory anyway, it used to be that the question was changed more often, or set of questions was changed more often. But the question now, I don't know, was it confirmed today what the new essay will be, if there is a new essay? We'll see. But what's that?
Just the dates, I think.
Okay.
Oh, he's confirmed the essays are actually the same.
Awesome. Wonderful. Amazing. So yeah, I was hoping that that's the case. I think it's an excellent question because it does allow for so much freedom, and they're not trying to trick you with the sense of like not telling you what to talk about. They are asking what more after having shared your resume, going into detail in the short answer section around, you know, what you've succeeded in, what have your challenges been at work. You know, you'll have a lot of room to cover a lot of material. So they don't want an essay that's going to be just rehashing all of that. Not that you need to ignore that experience and only talk about things that you haven't discussed before, but you want to help them understand what's what doesn't exist already in terms of their knowledge of you. And so the best essays I find are ones where it's like, oh, wow, I would never have guessed that, or that's so interesting, or now I get why this person has had this particular route. And I'm convinced now in terms of why they want to go to business school and get the degree and what they want to do moving forward. Or just understanding too, like that you're someone who has overcome a set of challenges. I saw some questions in the Q&A around, what if you've been let go, or what if you didn't always have an intentional pathway? There is space for individuals who have, recently or have come to some sort of epiphany and now want to move forward in a certain direction. You need to be convincing. And oftentimes what's most convincing is the truth. So understanding how to put those pieces together in terms of showing them, they're a place that does firmly believe that past performance is a great indicator of future potential. I think most top business schools, most M7 schools do agree with that. It helps them. These are not schools that, as Tangela even said before, that need to take risks, right? So HBS does get to choose. And so they want to see this like demonstrated, sort of like connection to you as a human, like what drives you, what is moving you forward, and what are you passionate about, and what do you want to do? The mission of the school is to educate leaders who will make a difference in the world. So understanding kind of like who you were, who you are today, and who you want to become, or another way to think about that is sort of like, where have you been, where are you now, and where are you headed, with helping them kind of understand, maybe beyond, like maybe there was something that happened in your childhood, or there's some family legacy, that is relevant to what you want to do and why you're pursuing the degree at this particular stage, and what you would have to contribute. And it's not just about telling them these things. I think that the secret can be to showing them, let the examples or the experiences tell a lot of that story for you. And it's complicated, but the reality is that like your story and your experiences should be your own experiences, and you should be able to talk about and be very personal. That was another question that I saw come up. You can be very personal, much more so than I think a lot of people would imagine. That's a great way. Being personal and being open and vulnerable is a great way to make a connection. One of the biggest challenges that I often faced in my years of working in admission across different schools was a lot of the essays were really boring. Like, write something that you would want to read. If you're looking at your application, like what else is there to you that is compelling or interesting that would make me want to meet you? You want to write a story where it's like, wow, like, yeah, I see some really interesting elements in this particular person that are believable and interesting. And I can't wait to meet this person and interview them. And I could see many different ways that they could contribute to this community. It seems like not just like an interesting, successful person, but someone who's a good human who's looking to do well by doing good in the world. So again, it comes in many different shapes and sizes. I think zeroing in on, what do you really have to offer? What are you really passionate about? And what do you want to do with your life? And how could Harvard help catalyze that? I think is an interesting process. It's certainly what makes my job so much fun, is understanding like, how do we fit these pieces together? So there's no one answer, and it shouldn't look like anyone else's essay or story. It should be your own. But where to go, what to focus on, what parts of your life, I think depends on what you've shared in the rest of your application, and what you bring to the table.
Right. Now you talk about engaging the reader. Tanya, as you think about that sort of level of authenticity, I mean, being yourself is at the heart of this. One of our viewers has asked, as Carla mentioned, where do you cross the line and it's too personal? What would your sort of thoughts be on that, and just that general guideline about it's you, it's your voice, your personality that emerges?
Yeah, I think Carla did a great job of sort of laying out this initial discussion. I think being personal is great. I think it humanizes you, which, among a sea of 9,000, upwards of 10,000 applicants, like, because of that, they're reading droves, dozens of applications a day, where the thing you want to do is stand out, be memorable. So if you're just going to rehash your resume, it's a completely missed opportunity. You want to paint a holistic picture of you, your journey, and context on like why you've made the choices that you've made. I'll give an example of, like, I think a good personal anecdote that someone brought in one of the former applicants that I worked with. But before I do that, I'll answer your other question of like when it gets too personal. I don't know if there's such a thing as too personal, but there's an important way about how you frame it. So if you've gone through difficult life situations, if you've gone through, something that the average person might not have gone through, I think that's totally valid to bring up. But we want to make sure you don't bring it up in a, woe is me, please pity me, like, please, like, I'm, like, things have been incredibly tough, therefore accept me. I think you need to tell your story in a very matter-of-fact way. Like, this happened to me, like, and I'm all the stronger, I'm all the better for it. But you don't want them leaving the essay feeling guilty. You want them to feel proud and like lifted by the journey that you've had, how far you've come. So personal, I think, is okay. If you've had difficult health situations, losses in the family, as it's relevant, don't bring them up. Again, this is the important part, is like, also don't bring them up for the sake of bringing them up, but as it's relevant to your journey. I think one good example of like how personal you can get is like, one example is a client who was really passionate about fintech and improving financial literacy for the underbanked. He came from a really privileged background, but quickly acknowledged that many people didn't know how to manage their finances like he did. He kind of harkened back to, when he was young. He was like 8 years old. His favorite time of the week was when he went to the bank with his grandfather. One, because it was the opportunity for them to deposit a portion of his allowance to savings, and for him to get an ice cream cone. So that any 8-year-old would appreciate the ice cream cone. But I think what he took away from it was like the many financial lessons that his financially prudent grandfather imparted on him, acknowledging that isn't the case, unfortunately, for many individuals. And that's sort of what started his interest and passion for fintech and what it can do. So he worked in banking for a bit, and then like pivoted from banking, took that skill set to working for a fintech company, and then talked about how he wanted to continue down that route. So oftentimes you would think these stories are like not relevant because they were from when you were 8 years old. Oftentimes provide a memorable context that, like, when they put that essay down, they remember you as one of the few of the day that really stood out. So when it comes time to like, do we give this person an interview? It's much easier to say yes.
Right. Now, with Fortuna, we have this extraordinary track record of client success applying to Harvard Business School from a very eclectic, diverse pool. I mean, Malvina, if you think about the number of candidates that you've worked with from so many different backgrounds, there is no one essay that worked for Harvard Business School. But what do you think is an essential sort of piece of advice for anybody to take away with them as they start to think about the application?
I think that one thing I really recommend is actually to look at all of the pieces of the application before you start writing the essay. I think often people jump into writing the essay without realizing that they're going to be covering a lot of that material, whether it's in the online application where you have to talk about challenges of jobs and reasons why you left and things like that, or the resume, or even in the recommendation letter. So look at what is already going to be provided through the different parts of the application before you jump into that essay, because HBS is very clear about not wanting you to just repeat information that they have elsewhere in the application. So that's something that it seems not that big of a deal, but it actually can make a huge impact in where you take your essay. The other thing is, I think the more unusual your path is, the more unusual your goals are, the more important it is that you explain that in the essay. And so if you have a very traditional professional path and you've written in the other parts of your application what your goals are, and it's all very straightforward, you may not have to explain as much in your essay. But if you've changed around industries and functions a number of times, you've gone the entrepreneurial route and failed, or whatever in the situation, and are now applying to business school, you'll need to explain that, and you need to explain what the end goal is, and so use that essay wisely.
Right. And again, just for viewers that are writing in, whether situations that you faced that changed your position at work, court cases, having a professional qualification, how that might reinforce. And for all of these things, do reach out, find us on Fortuna's website, and our expert team will talk through all of these different situations, anonymously or completely confidentially, of course. We realize these are your stories. And for Shubhanka, who wants to know the average length of the essay to Harvard Business School. Check last week's webinar where Tanya nailed that particular question. So I'm predicting, I think Harvard's record was somewhere around 10,400 applications back in 2002. This is going to be a bumpy year. I can see them edging towards 12,000 applications once they've completed the cycle of the 2+2s. So you're looking at what, a 1 in 11, 1 in 12 chance. But if you get to the interview stage, suddenly your chances have moved to 1 in 2 chance. And Carla, I know you have great memories, good and bad memories of some of the interviews that you conducted, were involved with. So talk us through the interview, what people can expect and how to prepare for it.
I love the HBS interview, and clearly biased, but it's not blind. So a lot of the interviews at competing institutions are sort of applicant blind. You'll just have an alumnus who's like looking at your resume and asking questions about that. At HBS, the person who's conducting the interview is going to have read your application, is going to have designed a particular set of questions based on everything that is in your application. So that's things that are in your short answer, there's things that are in your essay, there's things on your resume. A lot will focus on the resume and understanding the whys. Like, so you did this and then you did this, explain why. And they're looking for, again, authenticity, I think is a big piece of it, is like, are you who you said you were? Are you the person that we fell in love with on paper? Or I've had situations where I was like, almost had this moment of like, wait a second, there's no way that the person who wrote this amazing essay application story is the person in front of me. And that has been, that's sad. That's sad when that happens. The committee is really good at being able to select promising individuals, but there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And that's why I stress so much that, like, you want to tell the truth. Like, you don't want to fabricate goals that you're not actually interested in, because that's going to be really awkward. And they start digging into that. Okay, so you want to be a social entrepreneur, and tell me about that space. Tell me about what you want to do. And what are the companies out there that are inspiring and exciting to you? And who are the leaders who are in that space? It's like, and then all of a sudden it's like a deer in headlights. That's not a good situation for anyone. What they want to see, they're trying to weed out arrogance. They're trying to weed out people who are being dishonest. They want, and they're rooting for you. I think ultimately, like, they're excited. We were always very excited to meet the folks who would be coming into the room. And so, it's an interesting process. I think it's really fair. So when I say we, there's something that almost always, they try to, it doesn't always happen. There are, and it's nothing about you as an individual if you only have one person conducting the interview. One of the roles that I played on the interview board was as an observer, and I got to see a lot of the different individuals at HBS conduct interviews in many different ways. And it was so interesting to watch it unfold. But as the observer, I only had the resume in front of me. And so I would see the lead interviewer asking questions around, oh, your recommender mentioned this. Can you tell me more about that? And they mentioned this is one of the times that they gave you feedback. Can you explain what happened from your perspective? So anything is fair game within the application, but I think it is a really good way to assess, are you who you said you were? And can you put forth a compelling pitch for yourself, in terms of, like, not that I want people to have like everything prepared, but you need to be able to articulate in a convincing way that you believe what you believe, or you did what you did for a particular reason, because you're going to have to do that every day in the classroom. You have to be able to stand up for your point of view and your perspective. You have to be able to own up to your mistakes. And I think, you don't have to be a flawless individual. One of my favorite experiences was when someone was asked about, like, let's talk about a time that you failed. And he was so funny. He was like, do you want something from this week, this month? Do you want my most spectacular failure? Do you want that? And we were both dying laughing, because it was like, good for you for being, someone who accepts that level of, like, we all make mistakes. Whoever you are, you can't get through this thing in life without making mistakes. And sometimes your mistakes and your failures are your greatest teachers. So understanding that and having a comfort with it, it was infectious, and we were all laughing. So again, the interview itself, I think, is like, they're looking for a human being. They're looking for that authenticity. They're looking for someone who has these intangibles around, like, it doesn't hurt to be charismatic. It doesn't hurt to be charming, but you want to be yourself and you want to be comfortable. I think there were people who would be shaking with fear. We were talking about earlier, someone who was hyperventilating on the phone with Malvina going into her interview. again, it's fine to be nervous. And sometimes it would be like, you'd hope that the person would get comfortable as we went into the session. So, you want to do your best, but hopefully you'll be confident enough to go in there because you told the truth throughout your application. So it's not like you're, being investigated for something and they're trying to do a lie detector test. It's essentially, they want to make sure that they have the person in front of them that they really were excited to meet when they decided to invite you for an interview. So I love it. I think it's a great process. I think it's very straightforward. It's not layered with a bunch of like, tell me about a time when you were in this random situation and this random thing happened that like, seems almost like mental gymnastics around like, did something like that ever happen to me? They want the direct insight as to like, so you did this, you studied this, you pursued this, what made you go from here to here? Help me understand that a little bit more. You talked about it a little bit on the application, but I want to understand the context more broadly. So it's very conversational, I think. And a lot of times it goes by very quickly. It's 30 minutes and then you're done. And I know we're running out of time, so we'll wrap up. But I think that the interview itself is essentially, if you did a really good job in, putting your authentic self forward for the, in the application, it's not like I just kick up my feet and do nothing at that point, but it's like, as soon as you get the interview, then if we work together in the process, it should go well. Doesn't always 100% of the time, but the reality is that like, unless you're coming from a super competitive sector, once you get the interview, you should be able to sail through the process.
I'm really sure to know that you once exploded with laughter because from what you were describing of other colleagues, I could never imagine you with that poker face where there were no clues at the end of those 30 minutes. And yet you said those colleagues often were the greatest sort of champions of the people that they had interviewed with. Now, so we draw a breath after 30 minutes of the interview, and now there are 24 hours that remain for the post-interview reflection. Malvina, a key 24 hours, has that reflection actually started, do you think, before the interview? And what are you really trying to then share or capture in this final communication with the school that completes the application?
Yes, so the post-interview reflection is specific to HBS. And as Matt said, you have 24 hours to write it. You are encouraged not to write it before your interview. And I think that is very good advice. Because the content really should be about what happened during the interview. It's not something that you can pre-write. That being said, I think you need to be thoughtful of the logistics. So 24 hours is not a lot of time. And as Carla said, when you're having the interview, it's very fast-paced, it's very energizing and intense, and your adrenaline is pumping and it's exciting. And whether you're interviewing on campus and then having to figure out travel, jumping onto a plane or a train, or whether you're doing this online and you may have scheduled a Zoom call with your boss right afterwards, I think you want to make sure that you have at least 20 minutes after your interview to just jot down a few thoughts. Because what I have seen in the past is that because the interview is, once you've done with the interview, you have so much adrenaline pumping and you're so excited, et cetera, et cetera. If you go right into something else, you can actually forget some of that content that was discussed. It's just something that naturally happens. So make sure to carve out 20 minutes at the very least after your interview, and then write down a few notes to yourself. What questions did you get? How happy are you with the answers that you provided? Is there anything you would have liked to expand on? Is there any topic that you both engaged in and were excited about? You had a real conversation around. Is there anything that you wished you had covered that you didn't get a chance to cover? For example, you wanted to talk about your nonprofit work and you didn't have a chance to talk about it. So write down these notes and then just kind of put it aside and go do something else and come back with, refreshed mind, and then tackle the writing. And I encourage clients to not think about this as another essay. And actually, I think admissions by that time is kind of tired of reading essays. So, this is not about writing yet another essay. Think about it like a post-meeting memo, where you want to be nice and clear, concise, simple, straightforward. And you want to acknowledge the participants, thank them for their time, discuss what was the topics that were talked about, maybe expand on, an idea that you wish you had been able to talk about, so such as a nonprofit idea, and then talk about next steps. In this context, it would be that you're excited to join the community and what you would bring to the community, for example. You don't get extra points with this assignment. It's more it's more something that HBS gives you to have closure with the whole application process. It's an opportunity for you to have a last word, but you don't get extra points with it. So keep it simple, keep it really clear, concise. Again, you want to show that you have good communication skills, and this is part of the exercise. And yeah, and make sure you hand it in on time.
Before 10 minutes past 9. So we're running out of time. I think we have close to 100 questions, and we won't be able to cover all of them, of course. For example, a number of candidates have asked about being over 30 and applying. We wrote an article on Fortuna that's been read by over 245,000 people about the over 30s applying to business school. It's a great read. You can find it on our site, and hopefully we'll sort of explain, as Dee Leopold at HBS said, well, we don't have as many over 30s applying to the school, but if you've got a great story ready to share it. There are perhaps just two final areas to speak to. One is for the reapplicants, and I'll be approaching Carla for that, but if Tanya, I can just start with you. HBS doesn't have an early action like Columbia, the only the M7 schools that do, but they do, of course, have 2+2. And those seniors in college or during your graduate studies, and an ability to apply before those 3, 4, 5 years of professional experience that you might then bring. Any advice for the 2+2 applicant, Tanya?
Yeah, so I was a 2+2 applicant myself, and I think it kind of goes back to my earlier point about being able to show that you've come far for where you are in your given stage. So again, at that point, they won't have expected you to launch your own company per se, or for you to manage large teams, but the sort of different characteristics that Malvina highlighted earlier about analytical aptitude, habit of leadership, like that also applies. Like, I think your GPA and your GMAT score matters a bit more if you're a 2+2 applicant, because they just have fewer data points, right? They don't have a storied career that they can rely on. So important to have those be as high as possible. The habit of leadership, like they want to know that when you arrive on campus, you're going to be an engaged citizen. So if you have 0 extracurriculars on your resume, it makes me think, are you just going to come to HBS and kind of sit and absorb it, not give back in any way? So I think, especially for sophomores and juniors who still have a bit of time to add, I would be very thoughtful about the different leadership opportunities on campus that you're able to take. And again, just get them excited about, like, how are you going to be thoughtful about the time you're going to spend pre-business school? I think that's one question they'll very quickly want to know and understand is, okay, great, if we admitted you, what will that afford you to do? Like, are you going to act somewhat differently? If you have additional latitude, for in terms of opportunities. And I think the other bit of advice that also applies to reapplicants, because I think for many 2+2 applicants, it's an incredibly competitive pool, slightly more competitive nowadays than the traditional pool. I think it's dropped down to 8 or 9% of 2+2 applicants that are admitted. So the reality is there are going to be a lot who won't be admitted upon 2+2 and will need to reapply again. And I think this is where being authentic is really important, where you don't want to boast, I'm really passionate about sustainability and healthcare and I want to do that. And then you apply 3 years later and there's nothing about that in your application, because they will look back on it. They will see okay, what did you write about back then? Did you sort of try your best to do what you had set out to do or what you said you would do? And then how have you grown since? So the 2+2 application is not an opportunity for you to sort of fudge what you're actually passionate about, because if you do apply again, they'll pay attention to it. So just be thoughtful there.
And you brought us, Tanya, to the theme of reapplying, perhaps not for the 2+2 that then applies 3-4 years later, Carla, but just the reapplicant. They put all of their heart and soul into that first application. The essay was everything that I wanted to say. I'm going to reapply. Can I just reheat that essay and start again? What would your advice be for the reapplicant?
Absolutely not. Do not submit the same application twice and hope for the best. But I love reapplicants. And I think, there's 10% of the class every year is made up of reapplicants. It's a very reapplicant friendly place. I also do a lot of ding analysis, looking at why people may or may not have been, or were not admitted on the first attempt. And while there's never usually there's not a totally clear, sense of it. I have had situations where someone did write an amazing essay, had great short answers, their resume looks fantastic. Sometimes it can come down to letters of recommendation. You don't always have access to those. So, I think letters of recommendation are not something we talked about this time, but there's plenty of other webinars on that. But, just very briefly, I'll say that letters of recommendation don't necessarily get you in, but they can absolutely keep you out. And so there's some critical pieces, the feedback should not be something generic, like, oh, I told this person to apply to business school and look, they're applying to business school. Or I told them to stop being such a perfectionist. I feel bad for all the perfectionists out there, or maybe improve work-life balance. It needs to be specific, but reapplicants in general should look at, okay, what did I communicate last time? And is there an area that I can go deeper on? Or maybe since I last applied, I've had more clarity. I've had something happen that has further reinforced my commitment and drive to do X, Y, or Z. I think, they like to see that, most people, when they're told no, they'll walk away. They like to see that tenacity. They like to see that, I'm going to try again, or I'm going to see if I can come back this time even stronger, to kind of, further what Tanya was saying earlier on, have you been able to bounce back and overcome different challenges in your life? They like to see that. They want to see people who've had things not go their way, and then who are able to pivot and move into a different, either a different approach or show something else about themselves. I've worked with applicants before who, I'm looking at their applications and they succeeded the second time around because I'm like, this application is interesting. You've got great credentials, but I have no idea who you are. I don't really understand, what's really getting you, or they'll have spent their entire essay just talking about their, future speculation of like, I want to go do this. And then I want to go do this. And then I want to go do this. And like anyone can create that. And it's like, that's great, but why should I believe that? What should, well, essentially, hopefully you'll have something that helps convince them that like, whatever you'll be able to set your mind to, you'll be able to accomplish. But those are things that, again, you can work with a consultant on and get clarity on, because it's going to be specific to different vulnerabilities. Maybe you're going to retake the GMAT, but I would not just rehash some of the same letters of recommendation and just hope for the best. That's almost certain to fail. So you're going to need to, again, like maybe your key accomplishments from your past job didn't necessarily change, but maybe we can frame them in a different way. You want to show that you're committed and that you're willing to put in the time. Otherwise, it is a waste of time.
Right. So I think we've gone beyond our 6 C's. We've gone beyond our time too. But as you've talked about, authenticity, growth and development, being yourself in this whole program. Now, whether you have a background in derivatives trading or a high growth EV startup, whether you're thinking about just next steps, as I said earlier, please reach out to us so that we can talk through your story, your background, your questions. Perhaps not the most common question, but certainly the most common comment was thank you. Thank you to the panelists for sharing so much and providing so much advice. That's what we'd love to bring to the free strategy sessions that we have to offer. You see how lucky I am to work with these people. So Tanya, Carla, Malvina, thank you for this fantastic masterclass on applying to Harvard Business School. We'll be back next week, next Tuesday. I think we can mention the word Stanford at the appropriate moment. And then every Tuesday in the weeks that follow as we go through the entire group of M7 schools. But thanks for joining us. And this recording will be available on Fortuna's YouTube site. Thanks, everybody.